So Emily Dickinson is an American poet from New England. As you can see, she was born in 1830, she died in 1886, and she's one of the most important poets of the American tradition in the sense that she broke all patterns expected of a woman of that time. As you can see in the slide, it says that she refused to become the conventional woman expected of a woman in the 19th century. In what way? First of all, she did not marry. She led a life of seclusion, and instead of having a very active life, an active religious life as the rest of her family, at a certain point in her life she decided not to attend church any longer, and we are going to see that it had important consequences on the poetry that she produced. But one of the most important things of Emily Dickinson is that instead of writing poetry in order to affirm the values of American society in the 19th century, she used poetry for the opposite reason. She used poetry to rebel against the society of the 19th century that, as you can imagine, in that century and in the north of the United States was a very conservative society, very rigid, and women lived within the conventions of patriarchal society. So in order to see what we mean by this idea of poetry as resistance, we are going to analyze one of her poems. As you can see already in this poem, there is no title, there is no name to the poem, but there is a number, 569. This is one of the elements of unconventionality in the poetry of Emily Dickinson. So she was unconventional in two things, not only in the themes that she chose to talk about, but also in the way she approached these themes and in the different rhetorical strategies that she applied. So you will see that this is not a poetry that rhymes, this is not a poetry that is sentimental, but this is a poetry that is highly intellectual. In order to show her views on poetry, in this poem she will say, "I reckon when I count at all, first poets, then the sun, then summer, then the heaven of God, and then the list is done. But looking far back, the first so seems to comprehend the whole, the others look a needless show, so I write poets all." So what is interesting in this poem is that she is establishing a sort of hierarchy. So let's see which are these different categories which is hierarchizing. First of all, she says, "I reckon when I count at all." So she's going to count down things. She's going to establish that hierarchy I was talking before. First poets and then the sun. So look, she's first putting the poets above the sun. So first comes the poetry, her intellectual activity, and then the world of nature that can also be understood as the creation of God. Then summer, then the heaven of God, and then the list is done. So you can see that first comes the poet, second comes the sun, and then comes the figure of God. If you think about that, this is a very disrespectful attitude towards the figure of God, of course. And this is not what you would have expected of a woman in the 19th century. And what is interesting, that her tone is very irreverential in the fact that she is just listing them, just like that. But looking back, she says, "The first so seems to comprehend the whole, the others look a needless show, so I write poets all." So her tone becomes even more ironical, even more pointedly ironical, when she says not only that the poets comprehend all the other categories, but that all the others, even God, they are totally needless, so that she can do away with the figure of God. So pay attention to the syntax of the poem and to the different elements that she uses. As I said before, she does not use rhyme, but she uses capital letters. And she uses capital letters in order to emphasize the different ideas that she's trying to put on the center in her poetry. So you will see poets with capital letters, then sun, then heaven, then God, then list, and so on and so forth. So in a way, when she was capitalizing these letters, we can say that they had the same value as if they were little jewels within the poem, okay? So she was emphasizing in a very indirect way through the capitalizing of the words that she considered important. So what I was saying is that Emily Dickinson, she had this life that has attracted many, many biographers. And she made a very clear distinction, or sometimes not so clear, between the public life and the private life. At the time of her life, one of the biggest events in American history was taking place, and that was the Civil War. As you know, the Civil War took place between 1861 and 1865, and it was one of the cruelest wars in the history of mankind. However, in her poetry, in Emily Dickinson's poetries, you never find any sort of reference to the Civil War. In this sense, she was totally different from Walt Whitman, that he was a poet of the public, and he had a direct interest in the Civil War that became articulated in his poetry. But at a personal level, she raised a very dissenting voice. What do I mean at a personal level? Although she didn't lead a very public life, at a personal life or at a private level, she would disagree with the conventions of the society of the time. As I said before, she would work with unconventional themes for a woman, because women were expected to write about what? About family, about their children, about a loving God, let's say about the way in which they conform to the standards of society. And then this would have been done in a poetry that was a more traditional sort of poetry, following the form of the sonnet, for example, or poems that rhymed, okay, or that they had a more clear syntax, okay, so poems that were easy to repeat. But all these elements, in a way, are absent from Emily Dickinson's poetry. So already through the poetry that she was writing, Dickinson was showing her own difference. It is very well known, for example, if you do some research in the internet, you will find out that she led a life of seclusion. That at a certain moment in her life, Emily Dickinson started wearing white clothes and she refused to leave her house. So, of course, that was understood as a very odd attitude coming from this woman. Lately, it has been known that she had a very serious disease, and the fact that she dressed in white, in a way, was due to this disease that she had. But in any case, all this attitude, this seclusion, this refusal to go out, this idea of writing this poetry of rapture was showing already at that time the politics of difference on the parts of Emily Dickinson. And as you could see in the other poem, and we are going to see in the other poems we are going to analyze, what she was doing in a way was opposing patriarchal society. Imagine for a woman decided not to get married, to stay single, or not to go to church when she belonged to a very religious family, and instead of that writing poetry and of a very intellectual sort. So this is a way of going against the patriarchal society of her times. So just for you to see how she led this life of seclusion, or how she decided who to associate with or not, we are going to analyze the first stanza from poem 303. This poem begins like this: the soul selects her own society, then shuts the door to her divine majority, present no more. So first of all, she is here talking about the soul, okay? So selecting her own society. What does she mean by selecting her own society? Deciding who she would associate with and who she wouldn't. And these are different levels. Although she was very close to her family, to her sisters, to her nephews, to her nieces, and she had some friends, she would be very selective about the people that she would relate with or the people she wouldn't relate with. And she says that in the poem in a very cryptic manner, as you can perceive. Many times when you read the stanzas or you read the poems for the first time, it is not very clear what she is referring to, because the referent of the different metaphors that she uses are not always clearly stated. So the reader has to be a very participative reader, okay, that has to just to work on the different words as if they were little jewels in order to see to how many ideas or how many concepts they refer. So she will say, the soul that selects her own society and then shuts the door to her divine majority. And this divine majority, we understand that was all those people that she refused to relate to, okay? And then she ends the poem in a very open manner, as you can see by the last dash, when it says, present no more. And if you go to one of the anthologies of poems by Emily Dickinson, you will see, if you work in the other stanzas, that this divine majority is never referred to, that it is never identified. However, if you read all her poetry as a whole, you can work out what she means by this divine majority, and that the focus she's putting on in this case is precisely on her own seclusion, on her decision not to relate to others. So, as I said before, this idea of resistance, she manifested through her resistance to religion, although it's very interesting to note that she also in her poems talks about God, but you will see that she will talk about God in different manners and from different perspectives. And as I said before, she resisted patriarchal society or the male figure. Many times in her poetry appears the figure of a he. And she talks about this he with capital letters, but it is never clear who she's referring to. If this he is the father, if this he is a male figure, or if this he is God himself. Now, about this idea of resisting religion, okay, and in this way of resisting religion, marking her own difference, it is very interesting to read this poem 324. The poem says the following: some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. So let's see what the first stanza says. She's establishing her difference with, you remember in the previous poem, the divine majority. So here she is expressing, or she's drawing the difference between herself and the divine majority. The divine majority would be all the people who go to church, and she would be the one that prefers to worship God staying at home. So she says that she stays at home with a bobolink for a chorister. Instead of going to church and listening to the chorus of singers, she listens to this bird, the bobolink, and an orchard for a dome. And instead of being within the walls of the church, she prefers to be in contact with nature. She prefers to be in the orchard. So this orchard would stand for this word dome. You know that a dome refers to the upper part, okay, of a church. And then she says, some keeps the Sabbath in surplice. I just wear my wings, and instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. Again, she establishes another difference between herself and her divine majority. While all the others are in surplice, in a very humble way, preaching to God and worshiping God, she prefers to do just the opposite, to wear her wings and to express her freedom. So instead of tolling the bell for church, what she prefers to do is to listen to another bird singing. So again, you can see that she's doing a very interesting thing. She's establishing a contrast between church and nature. And we will see that she does that for a very important reason. And then she goes on. God preaches a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I am going all along. In this last stanza, she becomes pointedly witty and pointedly ironical, because she refers to one of the things that sometimes is very boring in church, and it is when the preacher talks for hours and hours and hours on the topic. So she says that in her way of expressing her own religion, the clergyman, okay, never talks too much, because this clergyman is God himself. How does she access to God? In a different way, as she is there in the orchard, as she is among birds. So she has this personal to personal relationship with God through the mediation of nature. And then she says that what is interesting in this, her own religion, instead of going to heaven at last, she's going all along. Why? Because we know that through religion or Christianity, when a person dies, the person finally goes to heaven or not, depending on the life he has led. But she says, if you are in contact with nature, if you can feel the presence of God in nature, then paradise is not something that will come at the end of your life, but paradise is the place where you live every day. Well, and I'm going to work on this slide, but instead of starting from the beginning, I'm going to start by the end. So you see that it says there that her poetry is a pivot between Puritanism and Transcendentalism. So in the case of Puritanism, she refused to obey the laws of the church, for example, by going to church every Sunday. But at the same time, she took elements of Transcendentalism. As you know, Transcendentalism is the version of Romanticism in America. And Transcendentalism talks about the relationship between man and nature. So as we could see in the previous poem, Emily Dickinson, by not going to church, she was in contact with nature all the time. However, she did not stick to the principles of nature one by one, because the principles of nature, so the principle of Transcendentalism, because some of the most important values of Transcendentalism were self-reliance and hope. And Emily Dickinson did not express in her poetry these elements of self-reliance, but these elements of doubts or thoughts. We will go back to that idea. So as you can see, she had a formal education. She attended a seminar for ladies, and also she did a lot of readings, mainly Shakespeare, the Romantic poets, and the Bibles, as you can see in the different subjects that she develops in her poetry. But as we said before, she took elements of Transcendentalism, but differently from Transcendentalism that had one of its most important aims or objectives, this acquisition of self-reliance. Emily Dickinson's poetry was a poetry of silence. And we will see now in a moment how she works on this element of silence in the poetry. She wrote a poetry of self-knowledge, because while she was writing the poets, in fact, when she chose a theme for each one of her poems, what she was doing was to analyze her main concerns, her beliefs, the main topics that affected her in her everyday life from different perspectives. Also, she was a poet of individuality, because instead of following the trend of the day or the fashion of the day in poetry, she preferred to write a poetry of rapture that was absolutely different from the established poetry. In many times, the style of her poetry is very opaque, so it means that you have to read them several times in order to see the different meanings, okay, that she's trying to convey through them. And going back to this idea of silence, why do we say that she was the poet of silence? During her life, she wrote 1,775 poems. When she died, her sister Lavinia found all over the place, all over the house where she lived, like little notebooks with many, many poems. Of all those poems, during her lifetime, she only published 7 poems. Why did she only publish 7 poems? Because every time she sent her poems to the different editors, they would try to regularize her syntax, they would try to regularize her punctuation, they would try to make them rhyme, they would give titles to the poems. That is to say, they wanted to turn her unusual poetry into conventional poetry. As she refused to do that, during her lifetime, she only published 7 poems. So talking about this idea of publishing her poems or not, a lot has been said. Many people say that she didn't publish her poems because in fact she didn't want to. But as we know, whenever somebody writes something, even if it is a letter, yes, it is to be read by people. And as I said before, it's not that Emily Dickinson did not want to have her poetry published, but that she refused to accept the conventions of her time, not only in her life, but also in her poetry. So let's read this wonderful poem, 441, that talks exactly about her own experience and frustration about publishing. So she says, "This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me." So when she starts saying, "This is my letter to the world," what is she referring to? She is referring to the 1,700 poems that she wrote throughout her life. And then she says in the next line that this is the letter to the world that never wrote to her. Why they never wrote to her? Because as she published only 7 poems out of the 1,700, she had a very little feedback from her public. And what is it that she writes in these poems? She writes the simple news that nature told. That is to say, you remember the other poem that we work on, talking about her views on religion, okay, her views on nature. That is to say, the different reflections about the world that she conveyed through her poems. And then she says, her message is committed to hands I cannot see. That is to say, eventually, if her poems were published, they would be committed to the public, and of course, she would never be able to be in contact with all the people reading her poetry. So she says, for love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. And there she uses the pronoun her that is not very clear. What is she referring to? Okay, which is the referent in this her? So we have to go back in the poem to see what she was referring to. And we will see that the her refers to the news that nature told. So what she's saying is that for love of her, that is to say, for the love of nature, what she's asking of her countrymen is that they be sweet and nice on her. Well, now we're going to have the first break in our class. I would like you to go back to the first slides to try to make a recapitulation of everything we have said so far, and then we will continue with the second part of our class.